It is Week 17 love-hate, and we'll start with the running backs, namely one that's been proving doubters wrong for the last month and a half.
What have you been able to attribute your success, especially this season, to? I know you had been injured for a couple of games, but just to be able to have that consistency, that resilience.
Just the doubters, man. Like, I've always been overlooked my whole life, so now that I'm finally on the stage that I've waited for to be on, I'm going to take every opportunity. I'm going to live it up. I'm going to let them know that, I am one of the best backs in this league. So they're going to have to, it's either you open your eyes now or you miss it. So that's just me just going out there and just loving this stuff and doing it to the fullest.
That was Rams running back Kyren Williams, who, no shock, leads the love list going into this weekend. Matthew, this has been the king of volume and, in large part, the king of production, especially since he returned from injury, headlining your love list going into Week 17.
Yeah, I feel a lot of similarity with Kyren Williams. We've both been overlooked our whole life. We're finally getting a shot, each of us this year. It's very exciting for both of us. And in terms of Kyren Williams, like you mentioned the volume, it's just insane. Right? Every game that he's played, he's gotten at least 22 touches. He leads running backs in terms of touches inside the 10-yard line since returning. Like, not only is he getting a ton of touches, he's getting a ton of green zone touches right there as well. By the way, running backs that have seen more than 15 touches against the Giants are averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. Again, you see it there on your screen. He's never had less than 22 touches in a game this year since returning from injury. And running backs that get at least 15 against the Giants always score well. So love-hate is not necessarily about obvious, non-obvious. It's about players that we expect to exceed expectations. Kyren Williams is my number 2 running back this week. Only Cris McCaffrey is higher in the ranks for me. He makes my love list. He makes my thank you for being there. Thank you for getting me to the fantasy championship, and thank you for bringing me the title this week list as well. Kyren Williams, number 2 on the ranks and leading the love list for Week 17.
Jay, this is somebody this week we've briefly talked about. He could be the second or third running back taken in redraft leagues next year, and it's completely earned.
Yeah, and I think, look, it's a good matchup against the Giants. The Rams are 5.5-point favorites. The Giants have the 26th ranked rushing defense in the league by efficiency, but it doesn't matter. Like, Kyren Williams is just the guy he is now completely matchup proof because that offense is just rolling at such a level. The offensive line, which was supposed to be a joke going into the season, now feels like a strength of the team, and with the space that Kyren Williams has with what Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, the attention they get on the outside, he's just a superstar. He's the number 2 running back for a reason.
And speaking of superstar, Jahmyr Gibbs has looked like that the second half of this season. You could see why the Lions place such a priority on this guy in the draft. He's our next running back on the love list with a matchup against the Cowboys this week. Yeah, and the Cowboys defense, you think of it as scary, but it's not a scary run defense. They really miss Jonathan Hankins, which is kind of a problem if your defense is falling apart without Jonathan Hankins. But think about what Buffalo did to them a couple of weeks ago, where they just ran the ball relentlessly, and Josh Allen only had to complete 7 passes for them to blow out the Cowboys. And now with the Lions have a better offensive line than Buffalo. They have a better running game than Buffalo. And I think that to mitigate Parsons and Lawrence getting at Jared Goff, I think they'll want to run the ball. So Jahmyr Gibbs should be an absolute monster this week, and David Montgomery should be as well. And Matthew, I think the difference here is that Gibbs is getting a lot of that red zone work despite them having Montgomery. They are finally using him the way you'd expect considering the draft capital they spent on him.
Connor, there's no question. Since David Montgomery returned, this is crazy. Like, we knew how much volume he was going to get with David Montgomery out. But since David Montgomery returned, Jahmyr Gibbs is top 5 in the NFL in terms of red zone touches. Even with Monty there, they are giving the ball to Gibbs in clutch situations. Oh, by the way, since David Montgomery returned, he's the 4th best running back in fantasy, Jahmyr Gibbs. Think about that. Once David Montgomery returned, from that point forward till now, Jahmyr Gibbs is the 4th best running back in fantasy. You think about this Cowboys defense, 25th against the run over the last month. So, yeah, give me Jahmyr Gibbs as a top 7 play this week as well. For all the people that were panicking early on Jahmyr Gibbs, why was he on your preseason love list, him and Montgomery? Well, this is why. So, yeah, you're welcome, America, for both of them.
Our next one here, Matthew, is essentially just who is the starting healthy running back for the Raiders. Is it Josh Jacobs? Is it Zamir White? Whichever one it is comes in on the love list against the Colts this week, and both have been great, especially since Antonio Pierce took over.
And because of the holdout and, everything like that, Josh Jacobs was on the preseason hate list. I have to mention that. And I think obviously that motivated him. So you're welcome, America. Once again, you're welcome for me putting Josh Jacobs on the preseason hate list. The fact is that whoever is like, listen, credit to Antonio Pierce because he's got the Raiders playing at such a high level. As of this taping, it's Thursday. We told you at the top of the show, Jacobs didn't practice yesterday. He's missed the last two. We don't know what his status is. If Jacobs can come back this week, great. But if not, Jahmyr White has sort of been a one-for-one replacement for him as well. Like Jahmyr White has gotten the majority of the running back touches with Jacobs out. And whoever gets the start for Las Vegas should have a ton of success against the Colts. They've allowed at least 100 yards from scrimmage to an opposing running back in 5 of their past 6 games. They're allowing 28.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running back. That's third most in the NFL. And so on the road at Indianapolis, expect the Las Vegas Raiders to feature their run game again. I mean, I thought this stat was crazy. Last week, Aiden O'Connell threw the ball for 62 yards in the first quarter and then not another yard the rest of the way. And they beat the Chiefs at Arrowhead. So Antonio Pierce and his staff know, like, you know what? If we just keep running the ball and playing great defense, because that's what the Raiders are doing these days, good things are going to happen. And so with the Raiders still alive, still in the hunt, I expect them to feature the run game heavily. Whoever's the Raiders starting running back is going to be a top 10 play for me this week.
Yeah, favorable matchup against Indianapolis. They could not tackle anything against the Falcons. And spoke about this yesterday. If you get past Grover Stewart, their best defensive tackle in terms of stuffing the run, then it's just a free-for-all because no one else on the team can tackle, seemingly. So it's a very favorable matchup. This Colts defense, they've spoken about this. They sell out to stop explosives because they don't want to expose their young cornerbacks without help, so they stay back, and you can run the ball on Indianapolis, and I suspect that certainly based on what the Raiders did against the Chiefs, that the Raiders will emphasize the run. That line is Indianapolis minus 3.5, which is a little big for me, given that they were just 3-point dogs to Atlanta and got blown out. So I'm not too sure about that one, but I think the Raiders will have success running the ball.
A couple others receiving votes this week at running back: DeAndre Swift, Aaron Jones, and Jaylen Warren all make the list here. Matthew, Swift as a top 15 play against that Arizona defense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key, right? I mean, the concern with Swift, they don't use him in the passing game. And if they get, to the 3-yard line, it's going to be the brotherly shove. So he gets vultured a lot. Having said that, no team in the NFL gives up more fantasy points per game to opposing running backs than the Arizona Cardinals. And teams that face Arizona this year are averaging over 26 running back carries a game. So DeAndre Swift should have a lot of success against the Cards. Aaron Jones, look, the Packers are so banged up at the pass catcher position as well. And so Jones, who's had at least 17 touches in back-to-back weeks, he looked great against Carolina. Not that he could get into the end zone in a playoff game that I lost by less than 6 points and had Aaron Jones starting. Like, could you have gotten him into the end zone? Like, would that have killed you? But either way, Jones looks good. He is running well. I expect them to lean on him against a Vikings defense that's given up 100 yards from scrimmage to a running back in 3 of the past 4. And then finally, Jaylen Warren. It's worth noting Seattle's a bottom 2. They're the 31st ranked run defense. They're bottom 2 in the NFL over the last 4 weeks. Jaylen Warren's starting to get a little bit more run recently as well. His 2 highest snap rates of the season have been the last 2 weeks as well. Also back-to-back games with a 20% target share. Mason Rudolph, not scared to dump it off. So Jaylen Warren, I think, is a viable flex this week.
Yeah, I think DeAndre Swift is the interesting one of those guys, just because we spoke about this last week. Like Philadelphia all season, they just haven't been blowing anyone out. No. Last year they were destroying teams and were in positive run scripts all the time. DeAndre Swift had 20 carries against the Giants. That was the first time he'd had 20 carries in a game since week 2 against Minnesota. Now all of a sudden, double-digit favorites against the Cardinals, who have a bad run defense. If there is ever a game for DeAndre Swift to, do what he did against Minnesota, which was 175 rushing yards, then this would be the type of game where he could do that.
All right, we move over to the hate list, which is headlined by Tony Pollard here. Matthew just makes it in as a top 20 play at RB20 against the Lions. Not a lot going for Pollard right now, included his workload is down, his production is down, and as we've said earlier on the show, one of the bigger fantasy disappointments of the year.
I think he's the biggest fantasy disappointment of the year. I put that out. We talked about that on the show the other day. I put that clip out on social, and I got people saying, well, what about Austin Eckler? Well, Austin Eckler missed time. And oh, by the way, he's been better fantasy-wise. And they'd be like, well, what about Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase? Both guys got injured this year. Cooper Kupp missed the first 4 weeks of the season. Like Tony Pollard's played every game. He's just been bad, right? I mean, and when you need him the most, He hasn't been there. You mentioned the workload. Back-to-back games with fewer than 15 touches. Back-to-back games with a single-digit target share, right? And you don't like this matchup against Detroit. 5 of the last 7 running backs to face the Lions have scored below 12 fantasy points. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs this season. And in fact, no running back has rushed for more than 67 yards in a game against Detroit. And so Tony Pollard, who, I mean, it's a simple thing, but Connor, did you see that play against Miami last week where they pitch it out left? Dak pitches it out left to Tony Pollard. He's got a chance at the end zone. All he has to do is take one cut to the corner, and he should be able to beat that guy and get to the pylon and score. And instead, he decides to cut inside and gets tackled at the 1-yard line. Like, I don't know if it's his vision. He's saying he wasn't fully healthy off the surgery from last year, but he's been bad.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. That play was brutal, and it's kind of a microcosm of his season in terms of just not being able to get in the end zone consistently, Jay, and why you're seeing a little bit more Rico Dowdle now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tyron Smith is banged up, which is a huge detriment for Tony Pollard. And this Dallas team, they love to throw the ball. They're 6th in pass rate over expected. And now they get almost the best matchup in the league to lean into that because, one, you have to score to be able to keep pace with Detroit. And Dallas will be throwing the ball because Detroit have a terrible pass defense. They have a very solid run defense. So it feels like if Pollard's going to have a big game, it's going to have to be as a pass catcher.
All right, our next running back on the hate list, Jerome Ford here, Matthew. He plays tonight, Thursday Night Football against the Jets. And for Jerome Ford right now, the Browns' run game as a whole, with him, Kareem Hunt, basically since Nick Chubb has been down, but these last couple of weeks especially, they've really, really struggled to run the ball. Joe Flacco's been airing it out.
He has been, and I've been, I'm putting my money where my mouth is, right? And I mean, like, I have Jerome Ford in our show league. I'm playing in the championship this week after, dispatching the stick men. There's some controversy going on in the show league, but I won't go there.
Please
go
do.
there. I know the blood draining from Steven's face. I'll from producer Steven's face. So I won't go there. Maybe we'll talk about the controversy next week or something like that. But at any point, the fact is we're in a 12-team league, super deep, super flex league. There's no one on the waiver wire. I already told you, I scraped together Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But even given that, I'm still not starting Ford tonight against the Jets, right? He's averaging just 2.6 yards per carry the last 4 games. 60% of his points has come from receiving. So you're like, okay, great. Well, the problem is that they're not using him in the passing game all that much. And in fact, over the last 4 weeks, the Jets have allowed the 8th fewest yards per carry to opposing running backs. They don't use him when they get in close. Yes, Jerome Ford scored last week, but when they get in close more often than not, they like Kareem Hunt. He's seen less than 30% of the team's red zone touches since the Nick Chubb injury as well. And so going against this Jets defense, I'm just super nervous. Ford bailed you out last week with a touchdown, but it was his first one in a while. And it's kind of this 2.5-headed committee because it's Ford and Hunt, and then Pierre Strong gets in there a little bit as well. And in what we expect to be a very low-scoring game on the road against the Jets, I just sadly having to bench Jerome Ford.
Yeah, this is a tough spot, Jay.
Yeah, it's not ideal. And just look at what the Browns weren't able to do against the Texans. It was just a joke. They could not do anything on the ground. And the Texans have a solid run defense, but I think the Jets have a better run defense. And we've seen that this Browns offense, it's a drop-back offense. They are having Flacco drop back 40-plus times a game. And I think that is going to be the way that they can put pressure on the Jets. So, no, not a good matchup. And if you can bench Jerome Ford, then you probably should.
Yeah, and I think with Ford, his best ability is his outside running, and the Jets with Quincy Williams, who might be the all-pro linebacker this year, they could stop the outside run. It's the downhill running, Kareem Hunt, for instance, that you worry about with the Jets. So I totally agree with Ford making the hate list. Our last one, Matthew, for running backs on the hate list, Gus Edwards, who it felt like every single week for a long stretch of the season he was scoring a touchdown. The problem is when he stops scoring touchdowns, he's not very effective in fantasy.
That's exactly right. He's basically a poor man's DeAndre Swift, right? I mean, DeAndre Swift is a guy who, doesn't score a lot of touchdowns, isn't involved in the passing game. So it's just really a volume-based play, and you need him to fall into the end zone. Whereas with Gus Edwards, he doesn't even really get the volume that much, right? Since week 9, he's only had 40%, one game. He's had one game with more than 40% of the team's rushing attempts. They've got Justice Hill. They were using Keaton Mitchell for a while before his injury, but now they've got Justice Hill, and of course Lamar is always a threat to run the ball. They're opening up the passing offense more as well. And so Gus Edwards, who's not involved in the passing attack, I know He caught that one ball for like 46 yards, on kind of a broken down play against San Francisco last week. But generally speaking, they don't use Gus Edwards in the passing attack. And so he's very, very much touchdown dependent. So it's a little bit like, how lucky do you feel? Do you think Gus Edwards falls in the end zone? And if he doesn't, it's going to be single-digit fantasy points. It's worth noting that since week 5, no team in the NFL allows fewer fantasy points per game to opposing running backs than the Miami Dolphins. You saw them shut down Tony Pollard last week as well. It's a very, very good defense as well. And so Gus Edwards, who has a target share below 3% since week 9, like he's a touchdown dependent, flex. And this week, championship week, I just think it's getting too cute unless you're desperate. He's my running back 35.
Yep, I agree there. And I think that one of the most underrated things about the season is just how good this Miami defense has been since Jalen Ramsey came back in week 8. Since that point, the Dolphins have the number 2 defense in the NFL. They're 4th against the run, 3rd against the pass. This is a very complete defense. Now, they've had a pretty easy schedule, but they still did play the Chiefs and the Cowboys in that stretch, but not a good matchup for Gus Edwards.
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBCSports.com and Rotoworld.com, and I want to thank you so much for watching whatever it is you just watched, or if nothing else, being too lazy to click out of the autoplay after this video started, after whatever it is you actually wanted to watch finished. But now that you're here, I'd like to take a moment here to ask you respectfully now, okay? I'm asking you respectfully to subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel. You'll get the latest Roto-World fantasy news headlines, all sorts of great shows, including my own Fantasy Football Happy Hour. So go subscribe now. Again, I'm asking respectfully.